Swing low. O chariot swing coming for to carry me home. Swing low sweet chariot. The promise of freedom in 1865. With the end of 4 years of bloody conflict in the spring of 1865, the Civil War concluded in Union victory. Enslaved men and women across the United States waited anxiously for the meaning of freedom to reach their towns and homes. In Louisville, Kentucky, emotions of joy and disbelief were stirred by the announcement of abolition. Dreams of reunion filled families who had been separated by auctions and forced labor. The promise of liberty was about not only leaving behind chains, but also building new lives with dignity, land, and wages. Yet, in Kentucky, the word freedom was fragile. Unlike in the deep South states, slavery had been deeply rooted in both urban households and rural farms. Louisville's economy, dependent on river trade, warehouses, and manufacturing, commonly used enslaved labor. While many African Americans expected to be treated as free citizens, local power structures resisted. Seeking to keep control through intimidation and manipulation were former slaveholders who had lost their wealth and authority. For the freed population, the end of the war was only the beginning of another struggle to claim rights that were written on paper but not yet respected in daily life. Louisville's fragile transition. By 1867, Louisville stood as a city of contradictions. Its streets bustled with riverboats on the Ohio River, transporting goods and people, while new jobs were offered by brick warehouses and tobacco factories. On the surface, Louisville looked prosperous, growing, and modern. But underneath, racial tensions ran deep. The city was filled with both hope and hostility as thousands of freed people tried to carve out a future. Fragile was the transition from slavery to freedom. Fair wages were often refused by white employers, or they used debt contracts to bind workers, creating conditions not far from slavery. White citizens were favored by police patrols and courts, which rarely protected black families. Reports of violence against freedmen circulated, and night riders threatened those who dared to demand justice. For women like Patsy Minkins, who had been enslaved in Louisville households, freedom meant continuing to serve under the same roofs where she had once been considered property. Churches and schools began to appear, organized by African American communities determined to rise despite resistance. In basements of wooden chapels or rented halls downtown, lessons in reading and writing took place at night. Both progress and betrayal were revealed by Louisville's fragile transition. While the city advertised itself as part of a new America, many of its black citizens remained trapped in old chains disguised under new names. Patsy Minkins' early life. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. Into bondage in Louisville, Kentucky in the years before the Civil War, Patsy Minkins was born. Her earliest memories, like those of many enslaved children in urban households, were tied to kitchens, laundry rooms, and small servant quarters behind brick homes. In the traditional sense, Louisville was not a plantation town, but slavery was everywhere, on riverfront docks, in tobacco warehouses, and inside wealthy families' houses. Patsy likely grew up watching her mother perform endless tasks for white employers, always under strict surveillance. Childhood was short. By the time she was old enough to carry buckets or sweep floors, she became part of the household labor force. Different from the vast cotton fields of Mississippi or Alabama was urban slavery. In Louisville, enslaved women and men often lived closer to their enslavers, sleeping in small outbuildings or attics. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, and sometimes worked in local markets, but they had no wages or rights. Shaped by silence and obedience and forced by fear of punishment was Patsy's young life. Still, she would have found moments of connection with other enslaved people in the city. A fragile sense of community was created by shared songs, whispered prayers, and secret gatherings. By 1865, when the war ended, Patsy was still young, but already carried the heavy scars of enslavement. For her, the promise of freedom seemed close. Yet, the chains of daily reality had not been lifted. The illusion of abolition. In theory, by 1865, slavery was abolished across the United States. The 13th Amendment had declared it illegal to hold people as property. But in Kentucky, where local laws and traditions still favored slaveholders, the reality was far more complex. For women like Patsy Minkins, the announcement of freedom did not bring an immediate change. Instead, she remained in the same household where she had been enslaved, expected to serve as before. False contracts or apprenticeships that were never freely agreed upon were often claimed by employers and former masters, who insisted that young black women owed them years of labor. Sustained by fear and manipulation was this illusion of abolition. Many freed people could not read or write, making it easy for courts and employers to trap them in fraudulent agreements. A blind eye was turned by local sheriffs and judges, who often sympathized with white property owners. Louisville's newspapers reported freedom, but in kitchens, stables, and workshops, the old rules of domination continued. For Patsy, daily life after abolition may have looked almost identical to life before. She woke early, worked long hours, and endured constant supervision. The difference was only on paper. Freedom existed in law, but not in practice. The painful truth of Reconstruction-era Kentucky is reflected in her situation. Liberty was proclaimed, but justice was delayed, leaving thousands of African Americans trapped in bondage long after the nation celebrated emancipation. Hidden bondage in the city. By 1867, Louisville presented itself as a free city under the Union flag. But hidden bondage was the reality for many African Americans. While the public celebrated progress, thousands of freed people remained trapped in systems that echoed slavery. Women like Patsy Minkins, who had once been enslaved in city households, were told they must continue working without pay. Deceptive contracts were used by employers, or they claimed guardianship over younger black women, forcing them to remain in service against their will. These arrangements were rarely challenged because the courts in Kentucky were dominated by men who sympathized with white property owners. Unique forms of control were created by Louisville's urban environment. On the busy streets near the Ohio River, black workers carried heavy loads, cleaned taverns, and served food. Yet, many were never paid. Instead, they were threatened with jail or violence if they refused. Another tool of coercion became city jails. African Americans accused of vagrancy or disobedience were arrested and then leased out to local businesses, echoing the slavery system in everything but name. For Patsy, this meant that even after the war's end, she still lived under constant supervision. Her days were filled with labor inside households, caring for children who would one day inherit the wealth built on her unpaid work. At night, she may have wondered if freedom was ever truly real. Hidden bondage ensured that many in Louisville remained chained not by law but by the power of intimidation, poverty, and injustice. Resistance and survival. Despite the crushing weight of oppression, African Americans like Patsy Minkins found ways to resist and survive. Resistance in Louisville did not always mean open rebellion. Instead, it took the form of quiet acts of defiance, delaying work, sharing food with neighbors, or secretly teaching each other to read. These daily choices allowed people to maintain dignity in a world determined to strip it away. Patsy, like many young women, learned to protect herself with silence in front of white employers, but strength in private with her community. Survival also depended on networks of trust. Families who had been separated during slavery worked tirelessly to reunite. In Louisville, groups of freed people gathered at river docks, hoping to find loved ones who had been sold south before the war. Both spiritual and physical refuge were provided by churches. Inside wooden chapels, messages of endurance were carried by songs of freedom. A powerful weapon against despair became faith. For women like Patsy, survival also meant using their skills. Cooking, sewing, and child care could sometimes be turned into paid work, though employers often cheated or underpaid them. Still, a step toward independence was every coin earned. Resisting did not always bring immediate results, but it preserved hope. By refusing to give up their humanity, freed people planted seeds for future generations. Not only her own was Patsy's survival. It was part of a larger struggle in which every act of endurance pushed back against the system of bondage that refused to die in post-war Kentucky. Community and church networks. In the years following the Civil War, the heart of survival and resistance in Louisville became black churches. For people like Patsy Minkins, these sacred spaces were more than places of worship. They served as meeting halls, classrooms, and community centers where freed people could gather without constant white supervision. In wooden buildings, rented storefronts, and even private homes, churches such as small Baptist and Methodist congregations began to appear. Here, African Americans shared news, reunited families, and organized schools for children and adults alike. A central mission was education. Lessons in reading and writing were offered by volunteers and teachers, sometimes freed men themselves or sympathetic Northerners. For a woman like Patsy, who had grown up in bondage and likely never held a book as a child, the chance to learn letters was revolutionary. Protection from fraudulent contracts and a tool to navigate a world that had long denied her humanity was what literacy meant. Emotional strength was also offered by these networks. In a city where white patrols and employers still controlled daily life, church gatherings gave African Americans a sense of belonging and independence. They sang spirituals that carried the memory of slavery and the hope of liberation. They pooled resources to help widows buy land or defend community members in court. For Patsy, being part of this network meant knowing she was not alone. Even if her days were filled with labor and surveillance, courage was provided by the evenings spent among her people. Symbols of a new future, fragile but determined, became churches, where freedom slowly took root in the soil of Louisville. Confrontation with authorities. As freed people in Louisville began to organize and assert their rights, confrontations with authorities became unavoidable. For women like Patsy Minkins, whose very existence challenged the old order, danger rather than protection was often represented by the courts and police. In Kentucky, judges and sheriffs were almost always white men who sympathized with former slaveholders. When African Americans tried to challenge illegal bondage, their cases were often dismissed, delayed, or overturned. The law was written to promise freedom, but in practice it was applied unevenly, leaving people like Patsy with little hope for justice. Still, there were moments when freed people pushed their cases forward. Before local courts, some men and women testified, describing how they were forced to work without pay or held under false contracts. In these rare public hearings, remarkable was the courage of individuals. Standing in a courtroom surrounded by white hostility, they spoke the truth of continued slavery. For Patsy, immense risk was carried even by the thought of bringing her situation into court. Speaking out could mean retaliation, eviction, or worse, violent punishment from those determined to silence her. Freedom was also controlled by authorities through vagrancy laws, which allowed police to arrest African Americans for being unemployed or simply walking at night without papers. Those arrested were sent to city jails and then leased out to businesses, recreating slavery under another name. This system blurred the line between justice and oppression, ensuring that black freedom was fragile. How deeply Reconstruction failed in places like Kentucky is reflected in Patsy's story, where the promise of liberty clashed with the harsh reality of institutions determined to preserve the old order. The weight of silence. For decades after emancipation, the story of people like Patsy Minkins was buried beneath layers of silence. Like much of Kentucky, Louisville preferred to tell a version of history that celebrated progress while ignoring the persistence of bondage after 1865. The truth of continued servitude was rarely reported by local newspapers, and white families who had once enslaved people erased these details from their family records. This silence was not accidental. A deliberate choice to protect reputations and maintain the illusion that slavery had ended cleanly with the war it was. For African Americans, silence often came from necessity rather than denial. Speaking too openly about mistreatment could bring retaliation, loss of work, or violence. Women like Patsy, who remained trapped in households after abolition, carried their pain quietly. Their daily survival required obedience in public, even as they whispered the truth in trusted company. In fragments were stories of hidden bondage passed down. A grandmother telling her granddaughter how she worked without wages, or a neighbor recalling the fear of night patrols long after the war. This silence shaped memory for generations. Without public acknowledgement, the reality of post-war slavery faded from Kentucky's collective history. Schoolbooks celebrated freedom but omitted the struggles of those left behind. That the absence of testimony does not mean absence of suffering is what Patty's experience reminds us. Evidence of how power can erase voices is her bondage after abolition. Breaking that silence today means restoring her story, giving recognition to lives that were denied justice, and challenging the myths that once concealed their pain. Remembering Patsy Minkins. To remember Patsy Minkins is to confront one of the most difficult truths of American history. That freedom did not arrive at the same time for all. In Louisville in 1867, she remained in bondage even after the nation had declared slavery abolished. The many unnamed men and women who continued to endure forced labor under new disguises is what her life represents. An act of justice, a way of ensuring her suffering is not forgotten, is remembering her today. That emancipation was not a single event, but a long struggle, uneven and often betrayed, is what her story teaches us. For Patsy, delayed by a society unwilling to let go of its old order was the promise of liberty. Yet by surviving, by holding on to her dignity, she became part of a broader legacy of endurance. Her silence, her labor, and her quiet acts of resistance carried meaning even when history chose not to record them. Giving her voice in places where it was once denied is what commemorating Patsy means. It means telling her story in classrooms, documentaries, and community gatherings. It means recognizing Louisville not only for its commerce and growth, but also for the hidden chains that bound women like her after the war. To see beyond the official timelines to honor the resilience of those who lived in the shadow of broken promises is what remembering Patsy Minkins challenges us to do. A reminder that justice delayed is justice denied and that memory itself can become a form of liberation is what her name stands as.